Two British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
For 137 years, the identity of Jack the Ripper has remained one of history's greatest unsolved crimes. The case is officially closed. That's not clickbait. It's a scientific fact. After 137 years, new DNA evidence has confirmed his identity. We are going to reveal the name, the science, and the story. But what nobody tells you is how this man, a known and violent individual, was allowed to roam free. The evidence doesn't just point to a suspect, it points to a man the police were watching.
DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
The truth isn't just who he was, it's why they let him get away with it. This changes the entire legend. The truth is more shocking than the legend, because this isn't just another crime story. This is history rewritten. If you want the truth behind history's darkest mysteries, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what we uncover next will change everything. Science versus the phantom. The whole story, the final answer, comes down to a single object, a stained, tattered silk shawl. For over a century, the legend of Jack the Ripper was just that, a legend. A ghost story made of fog, gaslight, and shadows. He was the unsolvable phantom, the predator who baffled Scotland Yard and vanished into history. Hundreds of suspects, zero proof. Everyone was obsessed with the idea that he had to be someone special. A brilliant surgeon with a dark secret, a mad artist, even a member of the royal family.
The Masons orchestrated the murder of the prostitutes who were blackmailing a member of the royal family, Prince Albert Edward Victor, who's Queen Victoria's grandson.
But here's the catch. The evidence that finally unmasked him wasn't a complex conspiracy. It was a piece of fabric allegedly found at the scene of the Ripper's fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, on September 30th, 1888. This shawl was passed down through the family of a policeman who was at the scene. For decades, it was just a morbid curiosity. Most experts dismissed it as a fake, just one more piece of Ripper trivia in a market flooded with them. So, here's the deal. In 2007, an author and amateur sleuth named Russell Edwards bought it at an auction. He was convinced it was the real deal. He staked his money and his reputation on one final desperate gamble, to use technology the Victorian police could not even dream of. Edwards tracked down Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a world-renowned expert in genetic analysis, from old degraded samples at Liverpool, John Moores University. This wasn't like a fresh TV crime show. This was a piece of silk that was over 125 years old at the time of the test. It was contaminated by countless hands, by time, and by the elements. Getting anything from it was considered a miracle. Dr. Louhelainen and his team got to work in a sterile lab. They focused on the stains. Using advanced techniques, they carefully extracted the microscopic genetic material left behind. They were looking for something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. What most people don't realize is that mtDNA is a genetic time traveler. Unlike regular DNA, which is a mix from both parents, you only get mtDNA from your mother. She got it from her mother, and so on, passed down in an unbroken female line for thousands of years. It's tough. It lasts a long time, and it's the perfect tool for cracking a historical case. The first test was simple. Was the shawl even real? The team tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They took a sample and compared it to the DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl. It was a perfect match. The shawl was real. It had been at the scene, soaked in the victim's blood. That alone was a massive discovery. But then they found something else. Mixed in with the victim's DNA were other trace samples, specifically samples consistent with semen. This was it. This was the perpetrator's genetic signature left behind in his moment of horrific rage. Now came the final step. Edwards and the team had a prime suspect, a man whose name was already whispered in the original police files. They tracked down a living female line descendant of that suspect's sister. They got a sample. They ran the test. Again, it was a match. After 137 years, the science pointed with 100% certainty to one man. And it's not who you think. It wasn't a prince. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a famous artist. His name was Aaron Kosminski. But Kosminski wasn't some new discovery. He was the man police suspected all along. The asylum secret. The name Aaron Kosminski doesn't ring a bell for most people. It's not the kind of name that sells books or lights up blockbuster movie posters, and that's exactly the point. The real shock here isn't that Jack the Ripper turned out to be some glamorous celebrity. The real shock is that he was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant working as a simple hairdresser right in the heart of Whitechapel. He wasn't some shadowy phantom drifting through the fog. He was a local man, living among everyone else, and the police knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had escaped Poland, which was then under the rule of the Russian Empire, fleeing the brutal pogroms that terrorized Jewish communities. He arrived in London with his family and settled in the East End. By every account, he was a deeply disturbed individual. He was known to struggle with serious mental illness, what modern experts now believe was paranoid schizophrenia. He suffered from terrifying visions, disturbing auditory hallucinations, and an intense, violent hatred toward women. This isn't just rumor or imagination. This is what investigators at the time genuinely believed. While the public and newspapers were spiraling into chaos over the infamous Dear Boss letters and wild theories about deranged doctors, the senior officers working the case were quietly forming their own shortlist, and Kosminski's name sat firmly at the top. In 1894, Chief Constable Melville McNecton wrote a well-known internal memorandum naming Kosminski as a leading suspect. He described him as a man with strong homicidal tendencies and a deep aversion to women. But here's where it becomes truly chilling. The most unsettling piece of evidence, the real bombshell, comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Swanson was the officer who oversaw the entire Ripper investigation. He worked the case day in and day out, right there on the ground. Years after retiring, he received a copy of his superior's memoirs. In the margins of that book, beside the section discussing the Ripper case, Swanson scribbled a private annotation. In that handwritten note, he stated that the perpetrator was Kosminski, the man who had been committed to an asylum and died there. This changes everything. The very officer in charge of the investigation privately confirmed the identity of the killer. And here's another chilling detail. Kosminski lived directly within the cluster of murder sites. He had a known history of violence. Then, in 1891, his family finally had him committed to an asylum, where he remained for the rest of his life. And when did the Jack the Ripper murders suddenly stop? Precisely when Aaron Kosminski was removed from the streets. The DNA findings, the timeline of events, and the hidden police testimony all point toward one frightened, unstable, and violent man. He was the monster. But to truly understand the monster, you first have to understand the dark and desperate world that shaped him. How London built a monster. To truly understand the terror, you first have to understand the world that shaped him. The London of 1888 was nothing like the polished romantic image of top hats and elegant carriages you see in films. Not even close. It was a city split in two. While the wealthy enjoyed grand homes and comfort in the West End, the East End, especially Whitechapel, was something closer to a waking nightmare. It was one of the most overcrowded, disease-ridden, and desperate places on the planet. More than 900,000 people were packed into just a few square miles, a chaotic maze of narrow, unlit streets, twisting alleys, and hidden courtyards. We're talking about population densities that exceeded 1,000 people per acre. The very air felt poisonous. A thick yellow pea-soup fog, a suffocating blend of damp river mist and heavy black coal smoke pouring from thousands of chimneys, wrapped itself around the city. At times, the fog was so dense you couldn't even see your own hand stretched out in front of you. For a predator, it was the perfect hiding place. There was absolutely no safety net. Poverty wasn't merely an inconvenience. It could very easily become a death sentence. At the center of this harsh existence was the common lodging house, often called a doss house. These were filthy, grim places where a person could rent a bed or sometimes just a patch of floor for a few pennies a night. Some offered what was known as a 4-penny coffin, which was exactly what it sounds like. A coffin-shaped wooden box to sleep inside. Others stretched a rope across a room so men could lean against it and sleep standing upright. For the women who would later become the Ripper's victims, each day was a relentless struggle to scrape together those precious doss pennies. They would do whatever they had to just to afford a bed and avoid spending the night exposed in a dark alley. That constant desperation made them painfully vulnerable. They were not glamorous figures from legend. They were middle-aged, impoverished, and exhausted women. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were simply trying to survive one more night. To do that, they walked the streets late into the night, through fog and darkness, searching for any small opportunity to earn enough money to secure a place to sleep. What many people fail to see is that this brutal environment didn't just conceal the monster, it helped create the perfect conditions for him to operate. The police were stretched beyond their limits. They had no radios, no forensic laboratories, no fingerprint databases. Their primary tools were a whistle and a wooden baton. In the confusing maze of Whitechapel, a man could commit a horrific act and disappear into the fog and the moving crowds in under a minute. The predator didn't need to be brilliant or sophisticated. He simply needed to be local. He needed to understand the back alleys, the shadows, the hidden shortcuts, and the fastest escape routes. And he needed to know exactly who to target. Women so desperate they might trust a stranger for a brief moment, and so poor that their absence might not raise immediate alarm. The streets themselves were a trap, and the police, despite their determination, were about to be pulled into a media-fueled frenzy that would send them chasing shadows instead of the man living quietly among them. When a criminal became a legend. With the entire city demanding answers, the Metropolitan Police Service launched what became one of the largest manhunts of its time. Officers flooded the streets of Whitechapel. More than 2,000 people were interviewed. At least 80 men were detained and questioned. Every possible lead was chased down. So why did they still fail? Here's the hard truth. They weren't only hunting a killer. They were battling the limits of the era they lived in, and a media storm that spiraled beyond their control. Forensic science didn't exist in any meaningful way. The very idea of preserving a crime scene was still new and poorly understood. When a victim was discovered, crowds gathered instantly. Reporters pushed forward. Curious onlookers trampled through potential evidence. Within minutes, a scene could be completely contaminated. There were no fingerprints to analyze, no blood typing, no DNA, just scattered witness accounts from people peering through thick fog on dark streets. One witness described a shabby-looking man. Another insisted he appeared respectable. The descriptions contradicted each other and led nowhere. What makes this even more unbelievable is that the police did uncover clues. They simply didn't know how to handle them. Near the murder site of Catherine Eddowes, the same victim connected to the infamous shawl, officers found a blood-stained piece of her apron. Above it, scrawled in chalk on a wall, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was this a message from the killer? Was Aaron Kosminski, himself Jewish, attempting to shift suspicion onto his own community? Or was it nothing more than existing anti-Semitic graffiti? The truth remains unknown. The police commissioner at the time, Charles Warren, feared the message could ignite anti-Jewish riots. He ordered it erased immediately. Just like that, one of the few pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation was wiped away. Then the letters began arriving, and the killer transformed from a criminal into a legend. The infamous Dear Boss letter was delivered to a London news agency. It mocked the authorities, promised more killings, and was signed with a name that would haunt history: Jack the Ripper. The problem? While the public became obsessed with it, most experts today believe the letter was a hoax, likely written by a journalist at the Star to boost newspaper sales. And it worked. The name stuck. The media exploded into a frenzy. The police were buried under thousands of copycat letters, forced to waste valuable time sorting through fakes, while the real killer remained free. But here's where it turns darker. One letter may not have been fake. The From Hell letter, sent to the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, arrived with a small box. Inside was half of a preserved human kidney. The writer claimed it belonged to one of the victims. And here's the chilling detail. Catherine Eddowes had indeed had a kidney removed by her killer. While the public chased dramatic theories about royal conspiracies and deranged surgeons, the real predator was still moving quietly through the same streets. Eventually, the case went cold. The legend only grew larger. But now, 137 years later, modern science has begun to question everything once again. The legend that won't perish. So that's it, right? Case closed. The DNA recovered from the shawl points directly to Aaron Kosminski, the police's top suspect. And the timeline of his confinement in an asylum lines up almost perfectly with the sudden end of the killings. On the surface, it feels like everything fits together seamlessly. It sounds clean. It sounds convincing. It sounds final. But hold on. Not so fast. This is exactly where the story becomes more complicated, and where the certainty starts to blur. Now it's your turn to weigh the evidence and decide what you believe. The moment the DNA results were published in 2019 in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the backlash was immediate. Critics didn't hesitate. Their central argument could be summed up in a single word: contamination. The shawl in question is more than 137 years old. Over that long stretch of time, it has passed through countless hands: police officers from the 19th century, members of the original owner's family, private collectors, and even researchers connected to Russell Edwards before the item was ever tested in a controlled laboratory environment. With so many opportunities for outside contact, skeptics argue it becomes extremely difficult to guarantee that the DNA sample truly belongs to the killer and not to someone who handled the fabric decades later. And that's the lingering question that refuses to go away. Is this DNA match the final, decisive answer that closes one of history's most infamous cases? Or is Jack the Ripper still an unsolved shadow, a mystery that continues to slip through our fingers no matter how much science advances? What do you think? Is this the end of the story? Or just another twist in a legend that refuses to die? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries.